And we're back again. With me are Stephanie and Lizzy from Who's Your ADDIE. If you don't know sort of what Who's Your ADDIE is, I'm sure they'll explain. But really, really awesome stuff. And this session, we were just saying, this is one of those topics that everyone in our industry goes, oh, it's so important. It's the most important thing. Everyone needs to know about this. And then you go to any conference and no one talks about it. And then we wonder why we get it wrong. So without further ado, I shall hand over and give you the stage.
Thank you. Yeah, we were worried that our topic was going to be the most boring one, but but it is something we're quite passionate about doing right. So just going to share my screen and then we'll get straight to it. Got quite a lot that we're trying to cover in a short session because a deep dive in 45 minutes is a challenge, but we'll try our best not to rush you through it too much. So yeah, our topic today is a deep dive on the needs analysis process. Just to give you an idea of who we are and where we come from. I'm Lizzy, I'm a product manager in the e-learning space. Been doing it for about 10 years now, starting in tech support and working my way all the way through. That's my dog, Kevin, who is our company mascot at Who's Your ADDIE. And then maybe Steph can tell you a little bit about Who's Your ADDIE.
Cool. So I'm Steph. I'm a learning experience designer. I've been in the industry for about 6 years now. And Lizzy and I started working together a couple of years ago in my first job, actually. And yeah, we're both from Cape Town, so explaining the random other picture. And about almost a year ago, we came up with the idea for Who's Your ADDIE, which is a multi-vendor marketplace for e-learning where you can buy and sell templates, assets, resources, and anything relating to e-learning. So you can either sign up as a vendor or a customer. And the idea is just to empower the community and for people to share their assets and resources and profit from it as well.
Yeah, so what we'd like to chat to you about today is the analysis process. We're just going to dip briefly into what analysis is, just because we know we have a varied audience. And then we'd like to begin with the end in mind. So what are the things that you actually need to make decisions about in the course design process? And then kind of pull questions out of those decisions that you might want to ask in the analysis process. So quick one on what analysis is. The objective of the analysis phase, which is goes by different names. Some people talk about discovery, they talk about needs analysis, learning analysis, various words for it, and different templates as well. But it's basically the first diamond of your double diamond in design thinking. It's making sure you design something that achieves the objective. So designing the right thing to solve the problem. And that's the hard part, because often the answer is not a learning intervention. But this is the process in which you'll discover exactly what you need to create and what it needs to do. And after that, you'll go into the process of designing things right. Designing something that is accessible, designing something that achieves the objective in the correct way for the context. So context in which analysis takes place, sometimes people talk past each other with analysis because they're talking about different processes, but they're kind of just different sizes of the same shoes, essentially. You have analysis in the context of a course or a subject or a unit, something small that wants to achieve a single learning objective or maybe perhaps a single organizational objective. And there will be multiple of these flying around in the same institution. They'll have different shapes because they're trying to achieve different things. Those sometimes take place within a larger program or curriculum or learning campaign. So you might have a single subject in an IGCSE or A-levels curriculum, or in the corporate context, you'll have your onboarding unit in your employee training program. And there will again be multiple programs within the same context. And these all exist in the same learning ecosystem. So I sometimes worry that ecosystem in this context is just a fancy sounding way of saying system, but I just wanted to get us away from thinking about learning management systems specifically. And the ecosystem is everything from the posters on the walls in the mess hall to the emails that go out every Monday from HR, and perhaps there is a learning management system as well. but it's the culture and it's how all these things are interconnected and create different perceptions about the learning process. Cool. Steph.
Cool. So for those of you who are relatively new to the needs analysis process, we just want to give you a quick overview of what it typically entails, and then we'll go into each part of it in a bit more depth later on. So don't worry about having to get all of this in now. We've got a template that we'll give out afterwards, and we'll have the deck as well that we'll give to Tom to add to the drive. But essentially, the analysis process always starts with the objectives, or should always start with the objective. So what is the problem, and what does success look like in solving that problem? Who are the stakeholders involved? So the subject matter experts, the accreditation bodies, the sign-off points, the delivery team as well. And who are the learners? What is their, what motivates them? What are their behaviors? What is their prior knowledge in the topic you're trying to teach? What are their accessibility requirements over and above the standard ones? And what is their home language, as well as their learning environment? How much time do they have for learning? Where will they participate in the learning? What device access do they have? And what are the system requirements? So Lizzy spoke about the learning ecosystem, and that obviously fits within maybe an institution or a company, but what integrations or data protocols does that include? And what does the content look like? If there is content that you can work with, what are the gaps within that content that you need to identify? And what do the assessments look like? Is there accreditation requirements you need to be aware of? Is someone specific that needs to maybe write those assessments? And from those assessments, what is the reporting? What do you need to report on to make sure you've met those objectives that you've identified? And what format does that need to be in, and who needs to access it? And how frequently do they need to access that? And then how will learners be enrolled in your course or learning intervention? Who's responsible for that? What happens when their enrollment lapses? And what sort of support will be available for them? So from a technical side, what happens if they lose their password or can't get into the system? And from a content side, what happens if they have a question about a specific piece of content or can't make an exam? And then how will learners find out about your learning intervention? What communications need to be developed? Is there a specific format that they need to be developed in? And who's responsible for rolling this out and through what channels? And then obviously just really practically, what's the rollout plan? What are the key deliverables, the key dependencies, the dates, the milestones? And is there anyone that needs training in these processes that you need to consider? So an analysis phase is incredibly challenging, and there are a lot of challenges that we can't get through today. But just briefly, I think one of the biggest challenges is just convincing people that an analysis is necessary. So I think a lot of clients or institutions start with, well, we want 10 courses of an hour each. And so why do we need to go take a step back and now do an analysis? We know what we want. And so convincing people to spend time and to spend money on something that is seemingly intangible is really, really difficult. And then from an instructional design perspective, getting immersed into their content and into their environment is also really difficult. So you might be dealing with an organization that you are completely unfamiliar with content, learners and stakeholders that you are incredibly unfamiliar with. And now you need to learn all these new processes, terminologies, and that can be really, really challenging to get immersed into that environment. And to do that, you need to get access to the relevant stakeholders and the relevant sources of information, whether that be a person or actual data. And that can be really challenging to get past sort of data privacy and to just convince people to take the time to sit and talk to you. Again, going back to that first point, they might not think that it's important. And then the thing that I think I find the most challenging as someone who's slightly OCD is that it's an iterative and chaotic process. It's not something that it's like, well, section 1's done, now we can move to section 2 and everything's signed off. It's, well, someone might tell you something in section 2 that throws section 1 out the window and now you have to just iterate on it. And that means that it's sometimes really hard to know when you've got the answers you need, because you could keep asking questions forever and keep iterating on the document. And you never know when are you ready to move to the design phase? How do you know you've gotten the right and enough information. And so, like I said, I don't think we can get through all of these challenges in 45 minutes, but what we really want to focus on is this last one. How do you know when you're done, when you've got enough information that you can confidently move to the design phase and you know that you'll have the right information to create and propose a successful solution? And so we think that to do that, we really need to understand the why behind the topics covered in the analysis process. And if we do this, we'll be able to have really meaningful conversations with our stakeholders. And then we won't be pulling up this document though in the analysis template and using it as a checklist, but rather we'll understand why we need those answers so we know what questions we need to ask. And so to do that, we really want to just begin with the end in mind. And so I'm going to hand over to Lizzy to explain what that means.
Cool. Yeah, I think for me, the understanding exactly what things in my design I will change based on what information I gather during the analysis phase is a useful way to think about it, because it's so time consuming that you can't waste your time asking the wrong questions. So how do we change a question like, what is the age of my learner, to give my famous example? How do we change that into the question we actually want to ask? Like, what types of media do they consume? That's what I actually want to know when I ask their age, or what are their technological competencies? So let's begin with what am I actually going to change in my course design to match, and then pull questions from that to see what we need to discover. So first, we'd like to think about what are the things I'm not going to change based on what I discover in the analysis phase. And this is where our best practice knowledge comes in as instructional designers. For me, a very important one is a wide range of different graphics, different people with different shapes of bodies. Even if your audience looks very homogeneous to you at the first glance, they might not be 2 days later when they hire another person, and that person is not the person you want to exclude because they're new and now you're scaring them. So second one is accessibility. You want to at least aim for a CAG 2.1 AA or something to that effect. This might be shifted a little bit back and forth depending on what your audience looks like, but audiences are not static. So you want a good base level of accessibility to work with. You want your content to be multimodal. So we don't like to affront or confront students with content that's the same over and over, and we tire out those receptors and create a bit of boredom and yeah, just a bit of variation in that presentation process. And then UX principles. So how do I navigate? Where am I? Where can I find the thing I was looking for? Those are basic things we want to get right to not distract from the learning as well. Accurate photos. So it's a very specific one, but it's quite an annoying one for me. Using stock photography that shows minors not wearing their hard hats or things. I've had quite a lot of designs and things thrown out by clients where we're teaching people the wrong things accidentally. So very important thing that will not change based on the requirements. And then accessible language, as Susie was saying, it's so important to not complicate the language unnecessarily, both from an accessibility perspective, but also from a learning perspective, to distract people with overly complicated writing, something I'm always learning to be better at, because it's actually one of my biggest weaknesses. I'm overly academic in how I talk. And then scaffolding. So whatever your system of scaffolding is, you might want to naturally start with the smallest piece and build in terms of complexity, or build in terms of plumes, whatever your particular beliefs are when it comes to scaffolding. You want some sort of framework with which to introduce the content to learners systematically. And then there might be some other things as well. I don't know if anyone has a suggestion for what I can add to this slide at this point. You could pop it in the chat. But yeah, we'd love to also hear your perspective on this. So now we come to the variable bits of the process. So what are the things that you would change based on your course design? What are the parts of your course design that you would change to better cater for the business case, the outcomes, the learner, and their context? So I've added one here, which is the objectives of the learning. So we would want to achieve a specific objective in the business, and therefore we would determine specific objectives in our course design. And I'd love to ask if there's anyone in the chat who would like to give us some suggestions for what else we can add to this slide. What are some aspects of the course that you would change based on the learner? Steph, you can add the first one. So I would add...
Okay, I'm going to pick an easy one and go with content. Because content will always change, just like your objectives will always change.
Yeah, I definitely have different... assessments. We've got one from Barry.
I'm going to add someone else as well, that assessment.
Assessments. Assessments and activities I'd almost put together. I'd also put in perhaps medium. That's a good one. So like the medium and the formats of the course. The writing style, could add that one in as perhaps learning content and style. Platform, that's an interesting one. So we could perhaps say for that one, let's say a learning model, because it's like your platform in terms of your tech, but also your platform, it might need to be blended as well. So taking the whole model into account as a whole. Thanks for that, Morgan. Okay, we've got some suggestions. Timing. So I would almost put that, chunking, yeah. So like how long is a specific piece of the content? How long is the course as a whole? Accessibility, yeah, you might have specific accessibility requirements for your group of learners. Okay, so I'm going to add from my side the learning brand, because that is something that you need to establish as part of your design process. Is what is the story here? Why do we want to learn? What does it mean to grow? Someone said writing style. So writing style is also a big part of the brand. How does the company communicate? We also have, perhaps as a spin-off from the assessment comments, would be the grade book. So how do we configure that grade book? What does it mean to pass? What does it mean to fail? And then perhaps something around the rollout, as we mentioned at the beginning. So by what time does this need to be rolled out and how? We could add systems of motivation as well. So that's always like a nuanced one that I forget about. Engagement, yes. So maybe motivation and engagement we can put together. So what is the thing that's pulling me along here? What do I care about? Stories. What are the stories we tell? So I would add this, stories and examples, so what are the things that these learners particularly experience? What are the things that they care about? So let's also maybe add, so job roles I would put as part of, so what's the aspect of my course design that I would change based on the job roles? So that would be the objectives. It would be things like the stories and examples, because naturally a manager's stories is different from a factory worker's stories. So that's an interesting one as well. Okay, so I would maybe add as well, just for us to think about, is the data protocol. So how is this report to that learning system that someone mentioned? How do we speak to it? And I would add language, so that we had writing style, but maybe the actual language that we presented in, do we need to translate it into anything? Yes. And then, cool. What's in it for me? Yes. So I would put that under systems of motivation, perhaps. Okay, so we've got quite a lot to work with here. I think the one that no one mentioned perhaps is the reporting requirements. I think that's the one we don't have yet. Medium format. So who needs to know who passed and how well they did, and did they engage, and all those, like, how do I design for that reporting process? Morgan got it. Thank you so much. Okay, So now we've got this whole list of things that we want to change in our courses based on the requirements that we might discover in the analysis phase. These are decisions that you have to make while you're creating your content. And based on those decisions you want to make, we'll reverse engineer some really useful questions, some of which have already been popping up. So let's take a look at that next. So there are a lot of approaches to answering each of these questions. There's data you can analyze, interviews, you can do job shadowing. Stephanie hilariously spent a long time pretending to be a merchandiser stacking shelves to understand the typical challenges, but she looked very cute in the outfit, I can imagine. And then many of the questions that we're going to talk about now are kind of repeated because you might want to take, for example, the location of the learners into account for more than one decision that you want to make. But we want to focus on what are the decisions, the design decisions I want to make, and then think about the questions. It's kind of a different way around of doing it, but it's a useful exercise. Cool. So let's start with the objectives. So there's two ways to think about the objectives, just to separate them out nicely. The first one is, what is the objective that the institution wants to achieve? So from a corporate perspective, this might look like we want to decrease the error rate in insurance claims processing by 20% by the end of Q1. So 20% fewer errors by the end of Q1. And that gives you a really good idea of how that's measured. It's measured by 20% by the end of Q1. Now you know you have to measure error rates as part of that reporting. And then from an education example, perhaps we want to achieve a learning gain of 1 across all grade levels in 2022. These are institutional objectives. They're not learning objectives, but they help us figure out which learning objectives we want to create to achieve these organizational objectives. A good question to ask here is it possible for a learning intervention to contribute to this aim? So the thing that I have to create, the objectives that it has to achieve, is it possible for a learning intervention to achieve this aim? And often it's a combination. So you'll see that you can help to decrease the error rate in insurance claims processing, but perhaps that's not the only thing that needs to happen. Perhaps they also need a better system for it. Perhaps there are bugs in the system. Perhaps the people are tired from too long shifts. So just be aware of the fact that even though you can contribute to solving the problem, perhaps you can't, or perhaps you're only a part of the story. The next question that's useful to ask is, what objectives do the learners need to achieve, and how will we know if they achieve them? So to achieve the organizational objective, what are the learning objectives that will realize this objective, this organizational objective? So these might look like concepts and knowledge that the students need to have. This is often the case in an academic environment, but it might also be the case for something like compliance training. Another one would be skills, habits, and behaviors that the learners need to develop to achieve specific performance goals, to become competent in something. And this would be a good example for our insurance example. They would need to be able to process insurance claims on the new claims processing software with fewer than 3 errors per month. That would be a good objective to achieve with your learning intervention. And from that, you can then create your learning outcomes. Very closely tied to the objectives is your reporting. So again, you want to understand what are the objectives the institution is trying to achieve, because that's what you're going to need to report on. And a lot of that is not going to sit with you as an instructional designer, but you need to be able to look at that data afterwards and see, did my learning intervention contribute to achieving the organizational goal? And again, you need to measure the learner's performance to understand, again, did my learning intervention impact whether or not they achieved their goal? And then importantly, who needs to monitor the learner's progress and achievements? Because you'll design assessments and activities to report on specific metrics. You might configure your gradebook or your course or your whatever you're using to track your information. You might configure it to specifically collect this information. It's really important to make sure that you design for the right data from the beginning. So this is important because then it'll help us measure whether this was a successful intervention, but it'll also help us monitor and see, are the students engaging? Are there errors in the content that we need to address? Do we need to offer additional support to motivate them, help them understand what's in it for them, and generally also be able to draw correlations between how much the learners engaged, how much they learned, and then whether or not that helped to achieve the organizational objective. And also understanding how often you need to deliver these reports if you are part of designing that part of the learning ecosystem, and the formats of those reports.
Cool. So learning brand. I know we mentioned there the language and the graphic style. So I guess this would also not just include the graphic style, but also things like, what does the organization value? What is their mission statement? What kind of metaphors do they use? So something simple like, do they use the idea of trees for growth? So things that you could leverage in the metaphors and the language that you would use in your learning intervention. And then what existing structures are in place that motivate the learners to do well. So for example, maybe it's a corporate environment that's quite hierarchical, and that really resonates well with the employees and the learners. So in an instance like that, maybe the learners would respond really well to hearing a message from the CEO, or in an education environment, maybe they would respond well to hearing a message from the dean. Something that we did once in a corporate setting is have the manager of the employees be the voiceover for a motion graphic. And the learners really, really loved that because they were in quite a hierarchical structure, and having that senior leadership voice was just something that they resonated well with. And then a really important question to ask is, what types of media do learners typically consume and enjoy? And this is not just a question of age, Lizzy's pet peeve of what's their age and their demographic, and then you can just draw all these conclusions from it. But asking a targeted question like this, because making an assumption based on their age is really something that is terrible, and I've done it. I had a client, and they were more corporate, and there was middle-aged men, and had a really strong idea of what I thought the learning brand would be and what they would resonate well with. And I was thinking sort of a lot of photos and a very clean graphic style, and almost like the men in suits sort of idea. And once I asked this question of what media do they enjoy, it was along the lines of like a foul, humorous, satirical, like South Park kind of thing. And what they wanted to see was something that was funny and something that was cartoon based. And I would never have gotten to that if I hadn't spoken to them. So it's a really, really important question to ask. But it's not just something you can ask about the learners, because I obviously can't use foul language in a learning course if the organization or a satirical, humorous type approach, you need to know what the organization's communication style is as well. Are they quite formal, or are they quite laid back? I imagine how a government organization communicates with their staff is very different to how a company like Slack or Google communicates with their staff, being a lot more laid back or transparent. And then what is just the language of operation and instruction? Do they all speak one language? Is there a language of business? Or they're often multiple dialects? And along with that is the important question of, is there budget and appetite for translation? Because that's a curveball you don't want later down the line. And what are the learners' literacy levels in these languages, or the language of operation? And then what is the learner's familiarity and exposure with technical jargon? Are you dealing with one group of learners that are maybe all undergraduate engineering, or are you dealing with the entire engineering department that ranges from undergraduate to postgraduate? And you maybe need to account for that in the way you pitch your content. And then systems of motivation. So what motivates your learners, and how can you leverage these to help them want to do your course or your intervention? So this could be in extrinsic things, so compliance, that they just want to meet others' expectations. They don't want to rock the boat. They just will do what they're told. Maybe they're in it for recognition. They want some form of public acknowledgement. They really resonate well with competition and competing against each other, or work avoidance. They just want to get it done and do the right thing in as little time as possible. Or perhaps they're more intrinsically motivated, and by a sense of involvement. They just really want to be involved with other people and in the organization's interventions. Or they're really curious. They want to find out more about their interests, and leveraging that would really resonate well with them. Or they're motivated by a sense of challenge, by figuring out the complexity of a topic, or by social interaction and creating bonds with others. And I think a big mistake here is often we make big assumptions, or our clients make big assumptions. I get asked all the time, let's go with gamification. We want a gamified course, but why? Are our learners motivated by extrinsic motivation, by the sense of a competition, or maybe our learners motivated by a sense of involvement, in which case, why don't we invest that time and effort into incentivizing peer-to-peer support? Because that's what would resonate with them, getting them more involved with each other. And this doesn't necessarily need to be one thing. We're not looking for that like one perfect thing to leverage. It's often a combination of these different methods or systems of motivation. And then learning model. So how are we going to present our content? Is it going to be synchronous or asynchronous? Are we going to be presenting it in person or online? And I think a key determiner here is, what is that outcome or outcomes that we determined right in the beginning? And is this something that can only be assessed in person? And I know that especially people in EdTech, we like to think, well, some things, and not everything, nothing can only be assessed in person, and we can simulate anything online, but think of like your driver's test. Some things, unfortunately, by regulation or certain reasons, can only be done in person. And so these are important questions to ask. Another key aspect that will determine the learning model would be, well, what is the group of learners? What is their context? So how large is that group? Can they realistically even fit into one room if you are thinking about in-person training? What is their location? Are they distributed in multiple locations and they can't all come together for in-person training? Or are they in multiple time zones, in which case synchronous training wouldn't make sense for them? Are they even in the same work contexts? And how are they grouped? Are they in the same level of experience, in the same teams? And what are their preconceptions and exposures to specific delivery models? I think having gone through COVID and a lot of people working from home, there's been a lot of exposure to online learning. And what is their preconceptions now towards it? And that's an important question to ask. I worked in a company where if you didn't complete your compliance training, you got a written warning. So you can only imagine how negative the employees were towards the idea of online learning. And that's a really, really interesting thing to know going into developing a training solution, because they will approach our training solution then with that same preconception. And then part of the learning model that you decide to go with is deeply dependent on your learners' access to devices. Do they even have phones or computers or tablets or whatever delivery model you're intending on going with? And do they need access to specific equipment? So for example, are you training them on how to use CPR equipment, in which case they need to go and use the equipment, or they need art kits or science kits or something, in which case maybe you need a blended approach or in-person approach. And I guess closely tied to your learning model will be the format you then choose to go with. How are you going to present your learning? Is it going to be video, interactive courses, games, and what format will that be in? I think a huge part of what you need to consider in that is, what's the learning environment that your learners will be partaking in these courses or interventions in? What are the spatial limitations or risks, opportunities? Are they in a factory where it's really noisy and quite dangerous if they were to put headphones in and try to listen to a video? Or are they sitting at a laptop where they get given 30 minutes a day for learning, or a week, and they can sit very easily and watch a video? Or they may be using their phones on a bus during their commute home from work. That would definitely determine what type of format, and different things would work differently for those different learners. And their time would be very different to what they have to spend on the intervention per session. Some might be quite intermittent. Some would be able to give a lot more attention to it. And the same with the access to device. So I guess in the previous section, we looked at, well, do they have a device? And in the sections more, well, what are they familiar with? And what is if it's an institution, what sort of software is regulated? For example, you might be thinking, well, let me do a YouTube series, and you have this great plan, and maybe it's a corporate and they block YouTube. Or I once did something that used a lot of GIFs and was only really great in Chrome, so I need to find out Internet Explorer is the only browser that any employee was allowed to use, and we had to rework the entire solution. So understanding their familiarity to different software, as well as what they are allowed to use and if there's certain firewalls in place, is really important. And then back to Lizzy's point on it being your solution falling part of a larger ecosystem is, well, what are the requirements from a hosting point of view as well? Because your solution needs to fit within the company or institution's existing frameworks. And then over and above the baseline accessibility requirements, is there anything more you need to know or take into account? So, for example, maybe designing a solution for kids at a school with low mobility, in which case maybe an interactive game where they have to use a lot of keypad interaction wouldn't really be a great solution, and something that maybe leverages video where they can use their other senses would make a lot more sense. And then a huge determiner is the subject matter. How complex is it? What are you trying to teach? That would obviously impact what format you would use. So maybe something that's scenario-based training would be great in a game, but a whole engineering curriculum wouldn't really work as a long-form game. And in what contexts or situations would the learner need to access the information? Is it proactive, where they're learning it and then needing to apply it later, or reactive, where they're on a shop floor and someone needs to ask them something and they need to pull up their phone or device and search for the content and need it on demand, in which case your format needs to be searchable and accessible on a phone, maybe a job aid. And yeah, so let me hand over to Lizzy to take you through learning material.
Cool. So the learning material. So from a very practical perspective, the first thing you need to figure out is, well, how am I going to write this content or develop this material? And an important part here is to figure out, how do I get access to the right subject matter experts? The time I found this the most challenging was when I was trying to develop a curriculum in financial engineering, and finding experts in financial engineering that are willing to accept subject matter experts freelance rates was a real challenge. So getting access to those right people will greatly impact how you budget this and how you end up designing the course. Same thing for content licensing agreements. Big corporates often have existing content licensing agreements with people like publishers or stock photography sites. So making sure you can leverage those sources might be useful to you as well. And if there is existing base content that's already been developed for a different medium of delivery, this might also help you to speed up your development timeline and also change the scope of what you actually need to do. In terms of accreditation as well, I've come across situations where the content developer needs to have very specific qualifications in order for the course or the program to be accredited. The same for presenting the content. There might be a pre-dictated order or duration for the program that you need to take into consideration as well. For the curriculum, does this fit into a broader curriculum? And if so, where? Are there prerequisites and co-requisites, which are words that are mostly thrown around in an academic context, but it's really useful to think of this in a corporate context as well. Are there things that people need to have completed before they start, or are there things they should be doing while they're doing this training as well? The relevant examples, so telling the right stories that people care about, things that they actually struggle with themselves, and therefore stories that will pull them along in the training or in the learning, because they want to find out how it ends and what happens next. So what's useful to ask here is figuring out if the learners have a shared frame of reference in terms of their socioeconomic background, typical challenges that they have to face, things that motivate them, things they fear, things that interest them. A classic mistake that I made once was we presented a course on budgeting for a bunch of learners that included a group of learners from a lower income background. And one of the stories we told was budgeting for a car when they went to university, which is a reality that the majority of the audience would not have found relatable at all. If we had chosen a different story, something that they could have invested in, or something that they found was something they would face imminently, something they could use this knowledge for, think it would have worked a lot better, but we just didn't ask the right question. And then are there differences for which you need to develop different streams of content? Then in terms of chunking or timing, how long are different sections? How much time do learners typically have to learn per session? Is this the kind of thing that you can take an hour to explain a really complex didactic concept? Do you need to make sure that they get that time in order for them to succeed in this learning program? Or is this something that you need to chop up and can chop up into small little chunks and deliver in a more agile and maybe even a less linear way? How frequently do they have time to learn? Because this will also impact how you think about your forgetting curve. So if they have to learn, if they only have about an hour once a week, you might need to build in more recap from last week, because they'll start forgetting quite quickly over that duration of the learning program, also depending on the total duration of the learning program. So is there a limited duration? Is there a deadline by which they need to know this? Because there's quite a good chance that one of these would need to shift. If they need to learn everything by the end of the month, then you need to give them more time, and then you need to give them perhaps time more often, even at work, to do their learning. In terms of the curriculum, so again, does it fit into a broader curriculum? Because this will impact how you chunk it up into pieces, and how you create sections out of it, how you control their progression, perhaps on a learning management system to stop them from accessing later sections before they've completed the prerequisites, and the subject matter. So again, is it highly complex? Because very complex things are harder to break into coherent pieces when you split them apart, because they need to be able to reference something that was mentioned a few minutes ago quite easily, to be able to create all the links and understand the big concept. So as Steph mentioned as well, the chunking will also, how you chunk it up will also impact how easily learners are able to reference little bits and pieces on demand, like in a job aid. They're trying to process a customer order. They need to go figure out again, how do I process payment? Breaking it up into smaller pieces and making it really, really easy to reference small bits will greatly help them with that kind of reactive use of the material. In terms of assessment, so what are the outcomes that we want to monitor and report on? It's really helpful to think of assessment through a data lens, because ultimately what you test is what you can report on. And what are these outcomes? Are there things that we need to test in person, like the driving test example, like human grading? There are still things that need to be graded by a person, and you need to resource. Do you have resources for that? Does the client have someone that can mark a human graded thing? Because as complex as multiple choice and or auto graded things can be, at the end of the day, it's really hard to reliably grade an essay if you don't have access to like the top of the range AI to do that for you. Are there existing assessments that you need to reuse? Perhaps something created by an accreditation body. Do the accreditation bodies want someone specific to create the assessments? What are the grade book categories? Do you want to know what the learner achieved in their formatives versus their summatives? And how do you know if someone passed? That's the most important question at the end of the day. Are there some categories we need to put them into? Do we need to put these employees into a performance improvement plan based on their results? And how do you calculate that threshold? Data protocol, probably one of the most boring ones, but so important to get right as well, because it'll impact what format you choose to create your course in. So to allow for collecting that required data, you need to figure out where will it be hosted and where will the data be collected. There's not always the same thing. So sometimes it's hosted in one place and the data is sent somewhere else. And depending on that, you might be able to use Storyline, you might be able to use Camtasia, depending on what's compatible with that context. So just another one to take into consideration before you commit yourself to a specific idea of what you want to create. In terms of support, so I'm quite passionate about this one because I think this is where things fall through the cracks quite often. And it's likely already determined by that bigger learning ecosystem in which you're designing. But it's important to take it into consideration as well, so that you know what types of support you need to try and build into your content that students might need to try and live without. Or perhaps you need to figure out how learners will access the content. So is it a matter of signing up for the mail and it's just an email course, or is it something that they need to be enrolled into? How will we support them? Presentation processes and communication. And then in terms of rollout, so how will we review and sign this off? User testing, change requests, reporting, evaluation, and then maintenance. So that's it. I think we're over time. So, but we try to get through it as fast as possible.
That was brilliant. I just sent you both a message going, oh, we've got a couple of minutes. But no, that's brilliant. Great stuff there. As I said, it's one of those topics where it is arguably, and everyone has a different view, as you say, but I think it's the topic where no one gets excited about getting to do a needs analysis. But if you don't, all the stuff that we love doing, like graphics and writing and all this other stuff, may do nothing. So this is such an important topic for us all to be talking about far more often. Thank you both so much. If people want to get in touch with you and connect, where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, that would probably be on LinkedIn. I think that's the easiest. We also have a template so that you can reference all this overloaded information a little bit more slowly, and then we can also post the link, the link to our LinkedIn.
Oh, brilliant. I can see that's in the chat. Thank you both ever so much. The next session is in just a few minutes, everyone. We're going to be with Sam, and we're going to be taking a look at EDAP, which is super cool. If you haven't seen it before, it's not one to miss.